Elin Kelsey is a science communicator, and what she communicates is hope and wonder. She's an intellectual pinwheel, firing off ideas and reports on everything from the composition of human breath to the life forms in the greatest depths of the sea. She's particularly fascinated by the life of the oceans. She lives in California and teaches at universities in British Columbia and Australia. She's a consultant who serves clients all over the world, a huge fan of the intellectual adventure that goes by the name of science, a brilliant teacher, and an internationally renowned author, particularly of children's books. She's deeply critical of the dominant narrative of environmentalism, that the world is being destroyed by human greed and that the only possible reaction is doom and gloom. Elin Kelsey is interested in ideas that work, people who make a difference, and stories that lift our hearts.
I'm really passionately interested in the relationship between people and this whole other than human world. I think that is what really drives me, and I think I'm a lucky person because in my experience, a lot of people who are deeply passionate about wildlife or about other phenomenon within the world sometimes don't find their way to people so easily. They really, and I think that's what makes them so wonderful at studying sea otters or whatever they happen to be studying. But I also am kind of crazy for people. So I think I'm a person who sits between the world of the extraordinary diversity of what life is on Earth and the extraordinary diversity of what people are.
So you're kind of a bridge. Huh?
I think I am, yeah. And I'm constantly interested in going to the edge of another field to see what is going on that is, can permeate between those fields. I like moving between fields.
Well, from what I see from your work, you're the last thing from a specialist. You're despite having a PhD, which you can only get by specializing, but ultimately you move around over the fringes of a great many areas, and but when I try to look at what's at the center of it, I think what I see is, you've come to care very, very much about hope and about the despair that many people feel when they go where you are.
Yeah, and I think part of that moving around edges and sort of constantly trying to see how things fit has enabled me to look in very broad ways. So by following different fields of science, for example, I was lucky enough to work with whale biologists years ago, almost 30 years ago, when I worked at the Vancouver Aquarium, and so I knew a little bit about how did whale biologists think about whales at that time. And then I went on to do some children's books about whales, so touched back in again to see how ideas in that field were moving, and then did a book on whales for adults. And what I was able to see through that was this real emergence of an understanding beyond sort of here are these species and where do they go, into this more and more recent ideas about the culture. Different whales have different cultures, different whales of the same species have different cultures, and now just this last month, the recognition that from that different culture we end up with different genetic backgrounds that are driven by culture, something we thought up until this point was only something that humans could do, where culture would drive genetic difference. So as you watch these fields change in science, it enables you, I think, to recognize that science is not a solid and held form. And I think this relates to hope in the sense that stories change. Things change over time. And the story of doom and gloom, which has permeated the way we speak about the environment, no matter where you go in the world and talk to people about the environment, that story of a wonderful place that is now wrecked is very common. And I guess in my life, I enjoy, there is never one story. There should never be one story. In a healthy democratic world, there should be multiple stories that are all, rich food for conversation. So the fact that something as extraordinary as all life on Earth is encapsulated with one doom and gloom story, to me just cannot be the way that it should be. And so that led me to look more deeply into the psychology of hope, and more, in recent times, more towards philosophical stances on hope, all grounded within what is really happening in all of these conservation efforts that we've been doing since the 70s that came out of the environmental movement. And what's remarkable to me is how much really is shifting at the same time as we have terrible environmental problems, and I'm the first to tell you they're urgent and they're horribly worrying, but we also have successes. And there's successes we don't hear about because we're so locked in that story of doom and gloom. So that's really my passion right now, is how do I move it so those stories are available so we can have healthier discussions about what is happening in the world and what's replicable from some of those successes.
You make a really interesting point that the news media really focus on conflict, problems, all that kind of thing, and that science is about problem solving to a large extent. And so the result is that both of them have an inherent focus on problems, not an inherent focus on success, right? So that's the story that doesn't get told.
That's exactly right. And you know, I think layered on top of that is we've had, we've come from a tradition where we sort of see scientists as the experts here and the lay public down here with some sort of deficit, you know, and you're trying to get information from the experts to the deficit public. And we know now from 20 years of public understanding of science research that that model is also faulty. That if we really think about the role of science within society, it's science is a structure that we've brought into place to understand the world in certain ways, that there are vast varieties of ways that people practice science, and again, this that people turn out to be very good consumers of science when they need to be. So for example, if I have a cancer diagnosis, I'm pretty good at finding out the science of cancer. It's not that I'm unable to do that. So motivation is important, and agency is important, and where you sit within that relationship. So I think that layered on top of this, mainstream media focus on, as it should be, on trying to figure out what's going wrong in the world. We have this role of science doing that, we have this role of the media doing that, and we end up just hearing negative things if we stay in the mainstream media.
Yeah, but there's all this, the successes are also great stories, right? The media, you would think, would have at least a part of their focus that would say, well, okay, what's going well here?
Yeah, and I think what's been intriguing to me is that the birth of social media, one of the things that's come out of that is that good news travels faster than bad on social media. And so as a result of that, if you go into the social media world, where so many of us are, we use social media to gain access to mainstream media. You know, these worlds are not divided, they're really integrated. But they did a very interesting study a few years ago looking at New York Times science stories and how many of them are shared on social media. And in that case, it's the good news, the few good news stories were shared far more widely than the negative stories. And so I think again, then that makes me very curious about what happens in the public communication of science in these different realms. So I guess that pulls me into yet another field.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating that the good news travels so fast?
Yeah, yeah.
I've sometimes thought that despair is a useless emotion, you know, that hope is a useful emotion. It leads you to go out and do something. And despair makes you curl up in a ball, turn the electric blanket up to 9 and never get out of bed, right?
Yeah, well, it's true that what we certainly see from psychological studies is that if we feel truly overwhelmed by something, we have a number of responses. We can try to shut it down or tune it out or just pretend it doesn't exist. And I'm intrigued often by people who I know who care about the environment don't often listen to environmental programs because they can't listen to that doom and gloom over and over and over again because they already know that feeling, you know, which is a problem. If the people who you most want to engage with something can't listen to the thing you're talking about, that's a problem. But I'm not sure I would say it's a useless emotion. I think it's a real emotion. I think we feel despair. But I do think that we can recognize when we feel despair, and we can also make choices around the attitude we might take towards something. And there is a body of work now coming out of the social emotional learning literature that we can learn to look at things in more optimistic perspectives, which I find intriguing. That we have true feelings, but we can also learn how we wish to address those feelings.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've alluded a couple of times here to studies in, I don't think your phrase was, well, conservation psychology is a phrase that's been associated with you. Tell me what's been driving your quest to understand psychological matters and what you think are the major findings that you've seen recently that we should all know about?
Yeah, in conservation psychology
Or psychology more generally, but I guess number one, what is conservation psychology? Because it isn't an immediately obvious phrase. Right?
Yeah, no, it's not. And I think again, really, I'm very happy to be the age I am because I was born right around the time that Rachel Carson was working on her work. The environmental movement was born when I was a person really interested in movements. So I feel like the poster woman of the environmental movement. It's played out in my life, and so I really have lived through these decades when we really used to talk about the environment in such clinical terms. Even the way we would talk about children in nature. I have a good friend who's in the green kindergarten movement, Enid Elliott, and she says, in her early days, they would only talk about children the same way we would talk about, in those days, the behavior of a primate. If A is moving toward the rock, B is moving toward, there was no voice for the primate, there was no voice for the child, And as psychology has moved forward, we've seen the birth of positive psychology over the last few decades, which says rather than looking at what's broken and spending more and more time analyzing that, why don't we look at things that work and spend more and more time analyzing what brings them to bear? And so I suppose I am a person who's interested in that kind of thinking. I like the areas of appreciative inquiry that say, who's ever in the room together is who we've got. So let's look at what skills and attitudes and passions we have here, and how can we make the most of that, rather than saying we must be missing out on some crucial role, so therefore we can't do anything. So when we work from this place of who's here and what can we bring, I think it really feeds our ideas of self-efficacy, our belief in what we're capable of doing. It helps us to recognize our agency, and it helps to inspire collective creativity. I think hope is a collective enterprise for me. I was lucky enough to be involved in creating a hashtag called #OceanOptimism, and I started that with two women who I met at conference talks. I said, I am really interested in this subject and I would love people to help me with it. And both of these women, one was Nancy Knowlton from the Smithsonian Institution, one was Heather Coldaway from the Zoological Society of London. We got together, three middle-aged women, interested in how do we change this narrative beyond doom and gloom. And 2 years ago on World Oceans Day, which was just June 8th, 2 days ago, we decided, wow, we need to meet with some young people who know something about public conversations and social media, and we ended up creating just a hashtag, #OceanOptimism. And as of the day before World Oceans Day, 2 years later, we're at 59 million tweets, which is people submitting conservation success stories from all over the world. And so I'm a firm believer that the capacity to do wonderful things exists within all of us. And I think we learn, unfortunately, in lots of ways, in the way we learn in schooling often, and others, that there's experts who know things and they do that. That technical model, technocratic model, still is very dominant. And I think we live in a wonderful age now where we challenge that. And good things can, a Twitter tag that has that kind of, gumption should not have come from three middle-aged women who don't tweet.
Well, maybe it takes a certain experience, a certain slant, a certain sensibility to see that possibility, right?
Yeah, or to believe in its possibility, and then to know that it's bigger than yourself. Movements are always bigger than one person, one idea, but I think stories and narratives, people recognize the narratives. When we illuminate them, people recognize the narratives that hold them, and then I think it's easier to challenge them or tweak them or move them, just as narratives always should be.
When as we talk, I think to myself, you really are located at that intersection between the understanding of science. Well, science communication was your field of study, right? In the first place.
Yeah. And it only came to be while I've been alive, like as a field, right?
Yeah. And although the phenomenon has been there for a long time, right? As so often happens, the academic
just not articulated
name comes
as
along,
so. Exactly.
later on, And the other thing that strikes me as you talk is that to some extent the story it depends on what you pay attention to. The story is itself a human construct, right? And we tend to think of science as being this big objective thing, but it isn't necessarily, is it?
No, it is absolutely a human construct. And I I think that is what drives us always to learn more and more, right? You learn, each thing you learn, you think, wow, I'd love to know more about the history of science. I'd love to know more about, how science plays out in different cultures in different times, in different countries. And I suppose part of what really has driven me around hope and this shifting the narrative beyond doom and gloom is that the pervasiveness of one particular story found in so many cultures and in so many, I've talked to really little kids who feel it so strongly, and I think, I don't believe that's an innate way to come out in the world. I think that's something that's been so heavily reinforced that it's come to be how they see the world. And to me, that is, that's dangerous. It's dangerous to invite people into an extraordinary world and then to label it in such a way that they feel helpless and demoralized. I think that's just not where we should be.
Now, how and why do you think that happened? How did we get to this?
Yeah, I think because we have lived in this remarkable time of our impact on the world, and we talk about living now in the age of the Anthropocene, right? The geological period that's really driven by a single species, ourselves. And so our capacity as humans to really alter the world is true and is terribly worrisome. And I think that that power and to see what we've been capable of doing in such a short time creates a lot of urgency and it creates a lot of fear. And when you have fear and you have urgency, you almost get that. Henny Penny's the wrong example because Henny Penny was running around screaming, I think, without a worry. but it is that sort of town crier mentality. We've got to tell people what's wrong, and we've got to shake them, scare them straight. We went through this whole love affair with the idea that we could scare people into behavior. And that comes out of old behavioralist models too, right? With punishment and we had very basic ideas about how we would affect change, behavior change. So I think we had this dominance of a behavioralist model that, here's how you affect change. We had a lot of global concern about what we've been able to enact on the earth that's worrisome. And you put all those things together along with a critical press and an elevation of science to be analyzing things in those ways. And you end up with this wonderful story that is so, clear. We've got a huge problem and everything's really a big problem and you better change your individual behavior and fix it. And that now what we know much more is that our individual behavior exists in cultural and social norming, and that most responses to things happen in collectives. And so our focus, we know this from health promotion, we need to look at social indicators of health. Wonderful work has been done in that area, terrifying work, where they're able to show now that 6 subway stops away in New York City results in a 10-year difference in lifespan, average lifespan forecasts. It's not about you as an individual knowing how to eat properly and not smoke, and it's also whether you have any access to good food, whether you can afford that food, whether you live in a place of violence, whether these social things that happen around determine your behavior very much. And I think the same thing is true in the way that we respond to the environment.
Well, I'm a little bit older than you, and I can remember growing up that sense that it was just inconceivable that human beings could make major changes in the world. I grew up in BC, and I remember being told that the BC forest was absolutely limitless, that as fast as we could cut it, it would regrow because it was so enormous, and we were such tiny actors in that scene. And of course, that's not true at all. That's that's completely, and once you, so that's but the effect was actually there. We were just being told that it wasn't, right? So the Anthropocene, the whole human impact on the world, that goes back a long way, but it's another one of these cases of what were we paying attention to?
Yeah, and I have a good friend, Don Worster, who's at the University of Kansas, and he's an environmental historian. Wonderful field that's just coming to life. But Don says that it goes back to, the discovery of the New World, right? Which of course wasn't a new world, but the New World, but it was experienced as if it was, as if that sort of, and he shows these fantastic maps that were drawn at the time of Second Earth. And it actually shows one Earth, as it was known, right beside Second Earth. And so this whole idea that we could have a whole second Earth full of resources for us to use, I think feeds into the story that you then heard, that these are limitless for us, and this is a limitless ocean. And he would say that that came from this, hey, I guess if there's a second Earth, maybe there's a third Earth. Like how we sort of came to that idea of limitless abundance. And these are, in a way, they're crack the whip stories, aren't they? Limitless abundance. Oh, now there's nothing left. It's, and I guess what fascinates me is what's happening in between all of that, which is also the capacity of this other than human world. We know that when people put marine protected areas into place, that on average around the whole world, you see in 10 years' time a 400% increase in biomass. That's incredible, and that's higher in some places, lower in other places, but that's on average. And we've, doubled the number of large-scale marine protected areas in just the last couple of years. So we've gone from, stories that change. I worked decades ago on trying to establish the first marine protected area in British Columbia, and it took us, many years to get a tiny little bit of water. And then in 2009, I wrote the scientific brief to try and convince George Bush to create the world's largest marine protected area as a blue legacy for him upon leaving office. That was a project for the Pew Global Trust, Pew Global Legacy. And they were very strategic and smart about knowing that he needed something upon leaving office. Anyway, that succeeded, and the world's largest marine protected area was created in 2009. And now in 2016, I'm happy to tell you that it's now the 6th or 7th or 8th largest, because we've seen such amazing movement in the establishment of ecosystem scale marine protected areas. And then we are able to see this remarkable resilience that exists within oceans when they're left to be able to do what they do best.
Now this is absolutely fascinating to me, because a couple of years ago, within a few feet of where we sit, we interviewed Sarika Cullis Suzuki, who was very, this is her whole passion and her whole area. And she was talking about how few marine protected areas there were and how difficult it was to get them established. And here you are, not very long later, saying they've been just proliferating.
Booming.
Yeah.
Booming. In fact, if you look through 2015 top stories in environment, a number of them will say 2015 is all about marine protected area establishment. And I think, again, a change in the whole sentiment around marine protected areas. It wasn't long ago where politicians would not even want to be associated with them because they'd be seen as, taking away fishing opportunities or whatever. So what little work was getting done was not getting broadcast. Now you have, smiling Obama in 2014 proudly showing that he extended the work that Bush did quite significantly. So a change in sentiment. And I think part of the marine protected area story that I find so compelling is also the change in sustainable seafood. So what we've seen is, it's now $11.5 billion industry per year globally. And it was nowhere on the map when that whole initiative started, 15 years ago. So as we're, the relationship between fishers, us as consumers, major food buyers, the way that has shifted as we demand more and more sustainable seafood, and those fishers who change to provide sustainable seafood are recognized, then rewarded in the market.
Yeah.
Then you see these booms, and I suppose the same exponential loss we see of species, we also see exponential recoveries when these factors come to bear and marine protected areas play out, and fishers are able to see the huge benefits. I talked to an octopus fisherman in one of the small island states in the Pacific, and he was telling me that a simple closure of octopus fishing for 9 months makes a significant difference in his catch. So some areas we know off the coast of California and off the coast of Mexico, 3 to 5 years of closure, we see more fish, bigger fish. So this resilience is astonishing.
Now, I don't think we've seen that here with the cod fishery. I mean, the cod fishery has been closed now for nearly 20 years. And there hasn't been much in the way of recovery.
What's interesting, because just now one cod fishery has been reopened and marked by the Marine Stewardship Council as sustainably harvested. There's a lot of discussion about how the cod fishery is in fact rebounding quite quickly now. And so this idea of it coming, but a lot of concern, and I'm happy to say that, around not wanting to move in too swiftly, you know, to really recognize it. But you're quite right, it was dormant for a long time. And now it looks as if things are really moving in that area. So again, stories change. And I think one of the challenges as people interested in science communication is that we had for a long time, as long as we had that deficit public, we only had to focus on what they were supposed to change and know. And really the harder part is for us to try and change and know, I think.
Well, even to change our minds about what's possible.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And,
Yeah.
tell me about the Mariana Trench, because that's the deepest area in the whole ocean,
It's the deepest ocean, it's the deepest part of the ocean. And what I loved about that time was a million years ago, I worked with geologists at the prehistoric park at the Calgary Zoo, and it gave me a little taste of geology. And when I was working on the marine protected area, what my job was to try and get a sense of what was in that area and what would be compelling reasons, scientifically based, for it to be established as a marine protected area. And the thing about the Marianas Trench is it's such an active area geologically, because it is this deep ocean trench, right, that exists right between these two plates. It's incredibly dangerous to go there. And scientists who I interviewed would show me footage of themselves on boats, you know, like trying to get out with these outboard motors while hot lava is dropping from the sky onto them, that's coming out of these underwater volcanoes, you know, like flying up and onto them. And they're trying to, you know, do bird surveys, and, you know, it was, so much of that work was not published because it existed, but it's one of these places on Earth that few people have ever gone to, and few people are able to experience. And so I did a lot of talking with geologists who talked about rocks being liquid and fluid, and, you know, not a rock like this, you know, but, and so you get the sense of this truly vastly changing landscape. It's one of the best places to look at life beginning, because life is constantly ending in the Mariana Trench, because things are so moving, and life comes back. 10 years, they start to see coverage of life again, coming in from other areas, you know, and very fascinating work on how do these deep ocean spots get repopulated.
Yeah, and with what do they get repopulated?
Yeah, and they think now of these, some of these hot vent areas are in fact almost like oases where life exists. And one of the theories is that the bodies of dead whales are actually the hopscotch points where life can sit because of that chemical materials that these organisms can live upon, and then they migrate to the next and the next and over to the next hotspot.
It's almost like a little ecology, those, I think they call
really
them
is.
whale falls.
Exactly,
right?
whale falls,
yeah.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
what an interesting idea,
I
like
know,
a rainfall, but
right?
a whale fall.
Exactly, and it's only been in you know, a few decades that we recognize this whole chemosynthetic world that exists without sunlight, right? That life that exists from chemicals coming out of the ground or out of these bones that is separate from our photosynthetic world. So, I mean, there's a story that changed. Everything requires sunlight, right?
Well, I'm struck by the way that almost every science has undergone radical change since I was an undergraduate. I mean, you know, biology was in those days mostly about taxonomy. You know, here's the phyla and then the genus and the species and so on, and geology was the world was thought to be quite an inert place. And you know,
Exactly.
I remember saying, doesn't it look as though the hump on the west side of Africa would fit into the Caribbean? And everybody says, what an interesting coincidence that is, isn't it? You know?
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. And then you
know,
discover,
I
no,
know.
it's not a coincidence. And the whole way that the world moves is quite different from what we thought. The time I spent with geologists when I was doing all the work on beaches,
Yeah.
I realized they have a different sense of time. And once you've got some sense of how they see time, it changes your mind forever. Right?
It does. And I think that's part of why I was so lucky to be a fellow at the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society, which is in Munich, and I was there 2 years ago. And I had mostly looked at the question of hope from conservation biology, and, you know, coming from my biological background perhaps was the strongest in me. And to suddenly be set loose in this place that attracts international scholars from all over the world, really does that beautifully, all from the humanities and many with this emphasis on environmental history, was like a candy shop, you know, for that very thing. It changed my view of history and time and culture, and how, for someone who was already interested in how stories shift, you know, to be able to look at how profoundly, just as, you know, your geologist friends are looking back millions and millions of years, right? They're looking back centuries of years in many cases. And, you know, what we believe shifts so much, and yet it doesn't. I'm reading right now a wonderful book, and of course I can't remember the name, but I'll try. But it's a 500-year collection of diary excerpts. And it's just random excerpts of people's diaries taken across time. And what you learn from that is how dramatically life changes, and how completely we stay the same. You know, like I flip through them and I relate to someone in the 1700s, and yet I look at the context in which they live, and there's nothing in common, you know.
Well, when you talk about conservation psychology, it occurs to me that in a sense, already seeds, that very term seeds a lot of territory to the other side, because the whole idea of conservation, of course, is to protect against loss, and the assumption of that is that loss is always a real and large and significant threat, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I will say, the conservation science, which conservation psychology is an offshoot from, coming from psychology and conservation. When conservation science was created in the 70s as a new field, it had two thrusts. One was to look at these vast problems we were experiencing on Earth, and the other was to generate literature around solutions. And unfortunately, that second arm of it really was vestigial in a way. It didn't develop in the same way, and I think it fascinates me as I interview conservation scientists. Those who do publish work around solutions have told me that that work doesn't tend to get cited as often by other scientists, which matters very much in the scientific world, but it's more enduring. People will come to it again and again. So I think these, I don't know, there's always more complexity to things.
Well, isn't there also, it also occurs to me that one of the implications of what you're doing is that it's not just, I'm not sure how I can phrase this, but it's as though we have a sort of a static world. We've arrived, you know, evolution has brought us to this point in time, and now we have to conserve what we have. But evolution isn't over. And so there should also be a science that says what's coming, what's flowering, what's next. And I don't see that very much.
No, and I guess what's been so incredibly thrilling to me about this hashtag, which now allows me and, you know, millions of other people every day to look and see what solutions people are writing about, you know, and sharing about, is it makes me think about that, what's coming. Because if these large-scale marine protected areas, there was just someone posting a few months ago around new forecasts of a world where fishing would be sustainable, you know, and we certainly were not seeing those kinds of stories, you know, and I don't mean that as some utopian idea. I mean it as like one of these nice, thorough research studies that looks at, you know, okay, if this is this rate of recovery that's possible, and we change fishing practices more towards rights of fishers rather than this sort of race to get out and catch what we can against each other. You know, you make these changes, which we are seeing the benefits of these different fishing allocation models in different places, right? I think our capacity, and it's not just a belief in a technological fix, it's a belief in the idea that as things show us and we learn more from them, I think we do adjust and change. And I am one of those people who went to university and they told me one day we would shop on something called a computer online, you know, and I thought that was fantastically fascinating and nothing to do with who I was. And of course, I shop online all the time now. So I think we're very good at predicting futures, and we're very good at not predicting futures because we often leave out the vast variables of all these other lives on Earth. You know, if there are all these, you know, between 5 and 50 million other species, I'm sure the way things go are not just the way we think they will.
Yes, and they are also evolving as we go along.
Exactly,
right?
and I suppose one of the things that thrills me lately is more and more work now showing the incredible individuality of individuals within species. You know, I think often when I watch these V's of geese going over my head, you know, it's not just a goose doing something as if it's some robot, you know. There are older geese up there with more experience. Sometimes it's geese traveling with their brothers. It's, you know,
it's a social activity.
It's a social activity.
Yeah.
The squirrels outside my window often live with their aunts. You know, if I watch them long enough, I can tell that they are the same squirrels coming back and then not there and then back. And, you know, there's just so much richness that we have taught ourselves to treat as if it isn't there, you know, almost because that was easier for us to make sense of. But it just is, it's thrilling to see the emergence of that.
Well, there's also the anthropocentric perspective that we have on this, so that, like, people sometimes look at me a little oddly if I say I really love and respect raccoons and coyotes, because they've figured out how to share our spaces and, you know, and live within the context that we've really established. And here they are in the cities and doing very well. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, the dominant food for coyotes, I learned from a biologist in Calgary, the city of Calgary, is crab apples. Yeah, who knew? They're, you know, that's, so again, we have, I agree with you. And I don't know, I think the capacity that exists within other species that we're just, there was just a wonderful article in the New York Times about the feelings of fish, you know, and that manta rays, you know, those beautiful rays that some people are lucky enough to go diving with. We often, scientists talk about mirror self-recognition as a sign of true intelligence, you know, that we can recognize that that's us in a mirror, dolphins can tell that's them in a mirror, you know, dogs and cats can't, you know, so they use this as a thing. Apparently manta rays can recognize themselves in mirrors, you know, so what does that tell us, right?
Well, and it also tells us that the way that we fish has to be a lot more respectful. And can't be indiscriminate in the way that it has been in the past. Although try and catch the rogue fishers who are cleaning the deep oceans.
And it means much more selective fishing, and it also means thinking more about the practices themselves, right? And I think an area where I think part of the reason people get nervous talking about the capacity that sits within other species for sentience or for feelings or whatever is it does inevitably, for me anyway, start to raise questions of rights. And for a long time, animal rights was an area where scientists were very, you know, there was such two different worlds. And now I feel like there are certain individuals who are really moving from science towards much more thinking about rights in these kinds of ways. You know, I think we were really in an animal rights argument coming from a philosophical stance. And now we're in an animal rights discussion, still informed by a philosophical stance, but also informed by a biological findings, you know, of these capacities. So again, a very rapidly changing area, and people who might have even a few years ago had very strong associations and feelings towards animal rights, but couldn't articulate that and hold their professional identity, are now more able to do so.
Yeah, and you know, the whole scientific enterprise has been so reductionist. You know, you cut it down, taking little tiny bites. And the theory always, there's sort of some unspoken understanding that you'd eventually put it all back together. Right. And then you'd really understand it. But instead you just kept chopping it smaller. But I think that bringing it back together sounds to me as though that's becoming something of a current in scientific circles.
I think it's huge right now. It's huge. And I see lots of young scientists who are moving between fields very fluidly, who, you know, who recognize that those boundaries just don't serve where they're looking. Whole new fields starting up, you know. I think it's a real time. And a lot of that, I think, is also a reflection of our capacity to integrate much more through the communications that we have. You know, we expect to be able to collaborate around the world, and we do.
Yes, that's right. And that also brings us to something that's another theme that we seem to have been running up against in our work. It brings us very much closer to our native brothers and sisters who. We just did an interview with a Mi'kmaq canoe builder not very long ago. Yeah. And he mentions that his grandfather said that the forest, when you look at a forest, he said it looks like individual trees, but below the surface, they're all holding hands together. And and the forest is not just trees, it's a community, it's a network, it's, you know. And he drew the implication this is the way we should live too.
Right.
And I suddenly think to myself, science is coming around to this point of view, which is ancient, right?
Exactly. And you know, it's so fitting that you said that, because one of the most popular nonfiction books sold in Germany last year was a book by a German forester, where he was talking about the social networks that hold trees together, you know, and this whole work on mother trees and how trees are connected by their microbial fungal networks that exist between their roots, so that if a tree dies, it actually can actively send its chemical energy to other plants around it. So holding hands or holding roots, it's about connection. Yeah.
There's a woman named Suzanne Simard at UBC.
I am a huge fan of Suzanne, and I was just trying to remember her last name.
Yeah.
Wonderful woman.
I have never met her, but I saw her work, and I published a column in the Globe Mail years ago about this connectedness of the plants and the fungi, and the Globe published it under the title "Communist Trees."
That's hilarious.
Isn't that wonderful?
That's great. I find her a very brave person, because she intentionally used words like mother trees. As a forester, she's a professional forester, academic forester.
Yeah.
Knowing that that was a risky thing to do, but because she did not wish to diminish I don't want to put words in her mouth, but that is my sense of her, is that she recognized that that would not be the easiest way forward, but felt like the more authentic way forward, and I admire people like that.
Well, that brings us around to another aspect that I wanted to talk about, which is the role of imagination in all of this, that, you know, she's able to see it, not just in a kind of mathematical way, but in an emotional way, in a social way, in a much broader way. Which brings me back to some of your work, because you've done all these wonderful books for children, and you don't present yourself as a children's author, but in fact you are a very fine children's author. And I was struck when looking at You Are Stardust, I was struck by the poetic character of the way that you inform very young people about important scientific truths. So there's that blend of imagination and science, which maybe is, if we come back to my original question, maybe that's a good deal about what Elin Kelsey is all about. Is that fair?
That's a very kind thing to say. I think that is true, and that book was really an interesting thing for me, because it marked a point in my life where I think one of the things about being insatiably interested in changing science is that one becomes very good at trying to remember people's names like Suzanne, but you know, finding the ideas that are coming out of science and then trying to share them in certain ways. And what that book did for me was, instead of being an explanation book, you know, that book I actually wrote first, you'll laugh, as a 96-page nonfiction book with all the science behind the concepts that are in that book. And the publisher changed, and the publisher was bought by a new publisher who had a new editor, and she came to me and she said, you know what, I don't think this is a 96-page nonfiction book. I think this is a picture book, and I think you can write it. And I thought, I have never written a picture book, but I had a lot of strong feelings around, you know, I've always felt very strongly that children should have access to current science, and so many books I read about science for kids are, you know, the ideas have not changed. You know, a book I wrote about bees and beavers and owls back in the 80s is still, you know, I see it, it was published by Grolier Publishing, and it's spread all over the world in different languages, and I think, you know, our knowledge of these animals has changed significantly, but those books endure. But anyway, she said to me, I think this is a picture book. And so that really pushed me to find my own voice rather than to interpret the voices of others. And I think that when I talked to palynologists, you know, scientists who study pollen grains, and they were talking to me about how, you know, we inhale all this pollen and then we exhale all this pollen. And I said to one of them, does that mean that we are, you know, when we exhale, are we helping to pollinate? And he said, yes. And I thought, so, you know, every time you exhale, you blow a kiss to the world, you know, that could become a flower, was a very deep feeling for me. And so I really credit Mary Beth Leatherdale, who was the editor, for pushing me, helping me to find that voice. And I think it's a much, much better book, because it doesn't tell you the science of palynology. It allows you to know your connection to the flowers around you.
Well, it's a unique book, I think, and and you found a beautiful language to match the beauty of the concepts you were talking about. Like a sentence like, your breath is alive with the promise of flowers, which you've just explained. But what a fabulous way to see that, you know?
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And it's interesting to me because sometimes people will write to me and they'll say, you know, I really want to know what that means. Is that true? Right, that can't be true because there's no scientist in that book saying that, you know? And I'm content with that because I think it creates conversation, and I'm happy to share whatever references if people want them, but I think it's a better book because it's about exploring our true connections. You know, we are just nature, no matter how we think about it. We are nature.
Well, it's really a kind of poetry of nature, isn't it? You know, and it occurred to me too that the other thing that it communicates wonderfully, and that I think is so important and ties so closely to what else you're doing, is the beauty of science. I don't think many people appreciate the beauty of the enterprise, and the scientists do their best to hide it.
Or the structures we've created with and for them hide it, you know.
So what's next? What's next? You've got appointments in Australia and in British Columbia, and you've had appointments in Germany, and you live in California.
I know. I am a peripateic person, truly in my heart. By what I like to learn about, it takes me in different directions. I mean, I'm so interested in hope and where that's going, and I think the next thing for me is I just got this conference yesterday and today that's going on, the Canadian Ocean Literacy Conference. I just met a number of really wonderful people here in Halifax who are super interested in how we grow this conversation around hope, and had lots of really interesting ideas around that. So I'm not leaving hope. I'm staying in hope, but continuing to invite and hope for collaborators who can help us. You know, if we really want to change a narrative, we really need to be speaking about it through many people in many places in many ways. And so I see that work going. I'm continuing to write and to find my own voice around that, and I think just more of the same. And I say that smiling because I know some other idea will come. And I think actually this movement towards giving voice to the other than human world, and where that will take us, whether that's in towards a rights direction or where that goes, that is a noise that will not stop in my heart. So.
Well, the rights issue, of course, is something we've just spent several years on,
yes,
both human rights, the human right to a healthy world, but also the right of the world to be healthy.
Yeah.
And that is, I agree with you. I think that is absolutely a huge direction, and it's a place where you can actually do things.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Which is, it doesn't leave you powerless, even if you think it's
and I find I'm like Marley in his chains. You know, I drag along whatever I'm interested in to wherever I'm going, and sometimes it is like Marley, like, I would like to be released from this, but you know, I just find this stuff remorphs and comes again, and I am thankful to live in a time of, you know, your kinds of broadcasts and podcasts where the ideas of others can continuously infuse into ourselves and awaken new parts of our imagination. So I see that as endless.
Well, the other thing that you have in common with a number of the people that we've talked to is that fundamentally, I think you're a storyteller. I think that's the answer to my original question.
Okay, now I know.
Who's Elin Kelsey? I think she's a storyteller, a very adept storyteller in a field that's not heavily populated. But that's what we've been told by the lawyers too, that legal cases are stories, and that the purpose of the law is to tell stories that lead us in appropriate directions. And the prominence of story in this world is really striking.
I think it is striking, and to hear other stories and how they then influence our stories, right? And how stories sit in context, and to illuminate the context they sit within. So.
Well, tell us a little bit about your teaching.
Yeah. Okay, so I teach in the master's program at Royal Roads University in Environmental Education and Communications, and what I have tried very hard to do in that teaching is to do all of my teaching outside, because I think that the way in which well, for one thing, I think I'm a person who just loves being outside, and I think many people do too. And Royal Roads campus, for any of you lucky enough to be there, is extraordinary. It's on the coast of Vancouver Island. It has one of the last stands of a temperate rainforest. It has beautiful Japanese gardens. You know, who wouldn't want to be outside? But when you take adult students and you run a whole class inside a tree, we can get up inside these, you know, cedars will form these rings, just like we have the rings forming with redwoods. And when you come inside what looks like one giant cedar, it's actually a number of related trees all together. And no matter who we are, at what age, we want to perch in a branch or we want to get down low. And this sounds like I'm doing some kind of kumbaya thing. It's not. We still talk about ideas that are coming from, you know, we bring researchers into that space physically or through their papers to debate ideas. We have rigorous debates, however one wishes to interpret that, but we're in a space where we can breathe better and feel what's happening, and where we're interrupted is not the right word, right? But by an owl that comes and decides to sit there for a while. And I just think we're much more open. And now there are a number of people, you know, we see this growth in nature kindergartens and others. We see it for young children. I'm interested in how it plays out for all of us, regardless of age. I think I just am always intrigued by, you know, why are we sitting in this space like this, right, with one person here and these people, you know what I mean? Like, I think so much of the structures we put in place tend to create those kinds of, like, we create relationship by we know this from architects, you know, like what is the null hypothesis of this room, right? It creates certain dynamics that I think then play out in those kinds of stories. And so no, I don't experience that. And I do almost all of my teaching outside. And maybe that's why I don't run into that. Ask young people to help me move in the social media world that they're much more comfortable in perhaps than I am. Maybe not. Not all kids are. But those who are, that helps me a lot. Or to know what it looks like through their eyes. You know, and I think my teaching, I try to use a number of facilitation techniques like open space technology, which is an idea where people come together without any for a conference or a 3-day meeting or whatever. You have no pre-prepared speeches. All you have is one question, and you are welcome to come to that question anytime. You know, if you're working in the cafeteria or you're a student in the course, you're welcome to come for whatever time you can. And the guiding principles are, whoever comes are the right people. Whenever it starts, whatever it's over, and whatever happens is the only thing that can happen. And together you collectively decide what you want to talk about when. People lead their own sessions. It's extraordinary what comes out of that. That is so different than if we all sat alone in our own spaces and said, here's the 3 things I want to talk about, and came and layered them on. And that particular work came from a man named Harrison Owen, and he developed that when he had finished doing a large conference that was all pre-prepared, and he realized the most significant learning was happening at the coffee breaks, because that's when you find the people you want to talk to and you talk about that which matters most to you. And he thought, what happens if I create a whole thing based on coffee breaks? And so I try and, you know, some of my classes are structured that way, some of them are structured other ways, because I think we need to play with this idea of how we learn and how we learn about ourselves and what we can most effectively do.
This is a profoundly disruptive view of education.
That's why I have to be the tree on the West Coast. But no, that's not true. I did a walking colloquium which is when you just walk and create whatever you'll talk about, in Munich at the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society, with academics, high-level academics from all over the world. And we walked our way around this remarkable city that has an amazing past and an interesting future. And we started it in an art gallery because we wanted to look at the Blue Rider movement. Because if we were shifting beyond doom and gloom, that's a movement. And how did artists look at their movement work? And so it may be profoundly shifting, but I find people are very eager to be part of it. And I think a lot of that comes from, I think my part of that is that I really do believe we all bring lots. And so I'm never afraid. I'm afraid of a lot of things, but I am not afraid that nothing will happen. I'm never afraid of that. I know something remarkable is going to happen, and I think that helps as someone facilitating those kinds of experiences, because I know that's true, so I'm not afraid. And I think it's hard if you are afraid, then it's much easier to be an expert and tell things.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. But I mean, I say it's profoundly subversive of the educational system. That's a big vested interest itself, the traditional educational system, and it tends to narrow people in the way that we currently have it structured. And what you're talking about is broadening people and connecting them with things. I don't know how we marry that. I mean, at some point in the future, it seems to me, somebody said one time that if it had been left to the educational system to see us through the most difficult learning that we ever do in our lives, which is learning to speak, we would all be mute.
It's probably true. Well, and I mean, again, stories change, but you know, so many people who are now doing the teaching in universities are adjuncts, right? And I mean, it's I don't have my numbers right, but I think it's over 80% in Canada. It's a very high number, and they're hired, as am I sometimes, per course to do this thing with a set curriculum. You know, so that absolutely constrains that opportunity, because it's as if they are a cog in a wheel. You know, here's your thing and here's what you should say, and go ahead and do it, and there's no prep time, there's no time for students afterwards, and yet we still project universities as if they're these places that are, you know, all the people there are there together, learning together. So I agree with you. I think there are structures that are put in place that really are working against this, but I guess I feel like we're such species for communications, and there are so many ways we're communicating. It will drive a change in our institutions. You know, I think that's not going to shift. I think the institutions will shift, and we certainly see, you know, these open courses now, right? These giant, there's a word for them, massive open line courses coming out of places like Stanford and others, where, you know, 10,000 people all over the world are in that course. That's a very different model than, you know, coming to this place and sitting down and having someone smart tell you something.
So even with respect to the educational system, you have hope.
I have hope. I do. And I think my hope is because I have been very lucky in life to be able to live a life where I am able to learn a lot every day. And I think hope is engendered by hearing of what others are doing, and it gives you strength. You know?
Elin Kelsey, the anathema of apathy, the high priestess of hope. The Green Interview is also about hope. Most of the people we interview are leading the way to a satisfying and sustainable future. I introduce a number of these inspiring people in my TEDx talk, What Can One Person Do? And the Green Rights Project, which has preoccupied the Green Interview team for 4 years, is largely about lawyers, citizens, and legal initiatives that give us hope. You'll find out more about that at www.greenrights.com. For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron, and I hope that you'll visit us again soon.